About the Secretary of State Tillerson's trip to Africa, and he's in Ethiopia today. So this is the Secretary's first trip to the continent. He goes on to Djibouti, Kenya, Chad, Nigeria after this. But he spent a day in Ethiopia. He met with the African Union Commissioner early this morning, and he also met with the Ethiopian Foreign Minister. While he was there, he expressed concern over the new Ethiopian state of emergency. He asked for security force restraint and said that political dialogue, inclusive dialogue, was the only way forward for Ethiopia. What is your reaction to what's happened so far? What do you think we can expect from this visit?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for U.S.-Ethiopia relations because, in the first place, it's a new administration. It's an administration that's staffed by businessmen. And I think what that means is that their approach to diplomacy is going to be different than the Obama administration's was. The Obama administration was incredibly deferential to Addis. It relied on Addis Ababa for a number of essential services, including intelligence, participation in the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia, participation in the peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. And the Trump administration is still relying on Addis for those things, but is definitely showing itself to be more willing to criticize. And I think part of that comes from the fact that they are businessmen. They're used to having more of a take-no-prisoners approach to relationships. And I think it's it's a very constructive thing. Because in this particular climate in Ethiopia, it's important for the United States to express deep concern about the conduct of the Ethiopian government, particularly in regards to the state of emergency, which is becoming quite violent. Previous hesitation by the Obama administration and the Bush administration before that to show those concerns publicly, I think, sent a very strong message to the Ethiopian people that was often very harmful.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly, some of the things that have happened since we last did a Facebook Live, the last time we were talking, we said the imposition of a state of emergency following the resignation of the Prime Minister would be detrimental, and unfortunately that's exactly what happened. And so I think this administration has a really difficult kind of challenge in front of them to say, to talk about options with the Ethiopian government. And, one of the things that I certainly hope that the Secretary is saying behind the scenes, and I'm curious for kind of your input as well, is, to say there's still time. There's still time to pivot away from the state of emergency, to show these protesters and demonstrators who have really patiently and for the most part peacefully been asking for reforms and asking for changes in governance. And, I just worry that they may be running out of time. What do you think the U.S. can be messaging in terms of what Ethiopia can do differently?
Yeah, it's very difficult to guess at what goes on behind closed doors. American officials have always claimed that in their private conversations with the Ethiopian government that they have been strong on human rights and that they've been strong on security sector abuses. We're seeing a little bit more of that publicly with the Trump administration, and one can hope that behind closed doors they're being stronger still. But it's difficult because the Ethiopian government has always been very resistant to taking advice from the U.S. And it's certainly clear in their response to the state of emergency that they're not willing to be guided, unfortunately, in a lot of these matters. The U.S. Embassy in Addis issued a statement before the state of emergency came out that was very, very strong, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
A much, much stronger statement than any previous administration has put forward, saying that we disagree with the state of emergency, we don't think it should go forward. And their advice was ignored. It was ignored. And so what the U.S. can do is possibly very limited, but at the very least, I'm hopeful that Secretary Tillerson is encouraging the Ethiopian government to make as many inclusive gestures as they possibly can. Like you, I feel very worried that the patience of the Ethiopian people is growing thin. And the Ethiopian government has been sending very mixed signals about its willingness to undertake substantial reforms. The release of prisoners was great. One could argue that it was done under duress because it was in the middle of a wave of protests. But But then, of course, the declaration of the state of emergency was a severe setback. And the terms of the state of emergency are draconian, even by the standards of the last state of emergency. And so it's vitally important that now the Ethiopian government take the opportunity presented by the appointment of the new prime minister to get on a better footing. That is by appointing someone who can be perceived as a real reformer. And I hope the U.S. is pushing hard in that direction.
Right, and so what we know about this new prime minister selection process, it's all a little bit opaque, but we know that the kind of executive committee of the ruling party is meeting this weekend, and there are sort of a couple of top candidates, but your point about gestures and kind of signaling, I think, is very important in that, the prime ministership matters, and the signal of what that sends from the ruling party to the people, to demonstrators, it matters to people. And so if they choose someone who protesters feel like really represent their grievances and really are able to make some of these reforms, maybe they'll have more patience. What are your hopes for kind of what that process looks like?
Well, I can tell you what my hopes are not. I really hope it doesn't look like the state of emergency vote, because that was a travesty, a true travesty. The Ethiopian people have to have faith in the system. I mean, they are confronting a choice between open rebellion and using the process that exists to achieve reform. And when the Ethiopian government does what it did, basically to hold a vote on camera, announce that a certain number of people had voted in favor of the state of emergency, and then go out later and change that number without any real explanation, without providing a list of the people who had actually voted in favor, without any supporting documentation, it really undermines their own system. And governments cannot do that if they want to survive. I'm very concerned about the process to elect the new prime minister. And I hope that it's transparent. And I hope that it results in an outcome that the Ethiopian people can embrace. Because if it doesn't, I really fear what could happen in Ethiopia. The image of Ethiopia as a success story is a very fragile one. It's true that Ethiopia has had a lot of economic progress in the last few years, but that progress has been very uneven. It's been concentrated on a very small number of people, and the vast majority of Ethiopians have been left out. And the structure of the state itself, this federalist structure that basically segregates the various ethnicities and in a way that leaves them unequal, it's highly unsustainable. And I fear that a lot of analysts, American analysts and European analysts, have chosen to paper over those problems. And because we've papered over the problems for so long, we're not now ready to confront and analyze the real state of affairs. That's been tragic in Somalia. It's been tragic in Eritrea, and I think it can very well be tragic in Ethiopia too.
Yeah, and you've made the point that for the U.S. government in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia has been our partner for 2 decades, and we don't really have a backup option, and perhaps that's part of the reason that we have sort of failed to see many of these kind of structural issues, but. For the Ethiopian side, it's not necessarily the same, right? The U.S. is not the only partner. We know that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was in Addis today at the same time as Secretary Tillerson. Certainly, Gulf countries are invested and interested in Ethiopia. We know that China as well, particularly in infrastructure and economic projects. Is the U.S. kind of losing its sort of partner of choice status inside the Horn, inside Ethiopia? Is there anything that you think we can do, whether it's about how we show that we are a true kind of partner of African nations and peoples? How does the U.S. kind of show its legitimacy and its willingness to partner with Ethiopia?
It's a really, again, just a tough line to walk, particularly for the Trump administration, because we have to remember there's a reason that Tillerson is in Africa right now, and it's to do damage control for the comments that President Trump made about Africa and Haiti. It is important to sort of backtrack a little bit and point out that Ethiopia's problems are not central to the U.S. and they're not central to Russia. The fact that Tillerson and Lavrov have overlapped in Addis is a coincidence. Tillerson did not drop everything to rush to Addis in response to this crisis. This was a trip that was set months ago. And likewise, Sergei Lavrov didn't rush to Addis at the behest of the foreign ministry to come and send a counter message to the Trump administration. All of these things are a coincidence. It's just unfolded this way. But it certainly reinforces the point you've made, which is that Addis is open for business. There are a lot of competing nations right now who are looking to increase their foothold in the Horn of Africa, not only in Ethiopia, in Somaliland, in Eritrea, in Djibouti. It's becoming crowded real estate.
Yeah.
And nations do have a lot of options. And it's important, particularly for the United States, to be a reliable partner and also a partner that's sensitive to the desires of the Ethiopian people.
Yeah.
My fear is that what has happened in the past, particularly in the Obama administration, is that there's a tendency to look at Ethiopia and say, well, the government wants this, therefore that's how you please Ethiopia. Increasingly, the people have a voice.
Yeah.
And it's vital for the Trump administration to signal to protesters, not only to the Ethiopian government, that they're a good partner, because the Ethiopian government can change. You know, the Tigrayan elite may not be in charge in Ethiopia in 1 or 2 or 3 years' time. And my longer-term concern is that the Obama administration before it and the Trump administration now can shoot itself in the foot if the Ethiopian people decide that they're not a good partner.
Yeah.
That they're more interested in supporting the status quo than they are in producing a real democracy.
Well, and perhaps Secretary Tillerson's comments this morning when he said, you know, not just to the Ethiopian government, but to the Ethiopian people, have patience, have some faith in your government that they will continue to show concrete reforms and give them a little bit more time. You know, perhaps that is kind of the start of that. And of course, he urged nonviolence, which is what we've seen from plenty of Ethiopian opposition groups for years and years and years. So perhaps that's a good start. I think let's leave it there for this morning. But thank you to everyone who tuned in. Feel free to comment and follow us on Twitter at AC Africa Center.